Welcome to Infidelity Diaries. Explore the secrets and stories of infidelity with us. How much do we really know about the people we share our lives with? How many secrets hide behind familiar smiles and everyday gestures? I never thought that the vacation meant to restore my relationship with Luke would turn into a true test for my heart and loyalty. It all started so innocently, so joyfully. I was expecting the sea, the sun, and a break from the city's hustle. But instead, I got, no, I won't be hasty in revealing everything right away. Let's begin from that day when the yacht set sail from the dock. And with it, our story opened a new chapter. Each time I closed my eyes, I could imagine the wind playing with my hair and the sun casting golden reflections on the surface of the water. This vacation was supposed to be a reset for Luke and me, a celebration we so desperately deserved after all the hardships of the past months. Luke and I met in college, and for over 10 years, we had been inseparable. But recently, our marriage seemed to be tested by routine. Luke had thrown himself into work, while I felt increasingly lonely, even though he was always nearby. In such moments, I often caught myself thinking that maybe we were no longer the people we used to be. But I still loved him, and I needed to bring back that spark that once pulled us toward each other with irresistible force. So, when Luke suggested a sailing trip around the Pacific Islands, I couldn't hide my excitement. However, his subsequent announcement that his cousin Ben would be joining us slightly dimmed my expectations. "Sarah, it'll be good for Ben," Luke reassured me as we were packing last minute for the trip. "He's just been through a tough breakup and needs a change of scenery. And you've known him since childhood, right?" I knew Ben, of course. He had always been part of our lives, but I wasn't sure if his presence on board would be comforting for me. Ben was the opposite of Luke, more open, more impulsive, more alive, if I could put it that way. Sometimes his carefree attitude seemed like a challenge to me, both intriguing and intimidating. But I agreed, trying to hide my irritation. After all, this was Luke's chance to support his cousin in a difficult time. When we boarded our rented yacht, I tried to focus on the upcoming adventures. The sea seemed endless, and the horizon beckoned with its mystery. Luke and Ben quickly immersed themselves in discussing the route, tossing around nautical terms, while I found a quiet spot at the stern. The first few days of sailing passed like a dream. We sailed from island to island, and each new sunrise was more beautiful than the last. But the longer Ben was around, the more often I found myself wondering what he would say next, how he would act in this or that situation. His presence became less intrusive and increasingly desirable. One evening, after a long day of navigating the yacht, Luke went to bed early and Ben and I stayed on deck, gazing at the stars. We talked about everything under the sun, and I felt an invisible spark between us, lighting up the darkness around. "Sarah, do you remember how we used to swim at night when we were teenagers?" he suddenly asked, his voice casual. "Of course," I smiled. "It was reckless, but so much fun." "We could—" His voice trailed off as he glanced at me, studying my reaction. I looked at him and saw the moonlight reflected in his eyes. My heart raced, and in that moment, I realized that this vacation would change everything. With each day spent on the open sea, I felt the accumulated fatigue and tension slowly leave me. The water became warmer and clearer with every mile, and the islands we visited seemed like true gems scattered in the vast ocean. But it wasn't just nature that brought a breath of fresh air to our days. Ben, with his restless optimism and humor, awakened a feeling in me that I hadn't experienced for a long time: lightness. His carefree attitude and ability to find joy in the simplest things were contagious. I started to notice how the corners of my mouth lifted into a smile more often as he told another funny story or joked about our little adventures. Luke laughed too, but his laughter sounded somewhat obligatory, whereas mine felt free. "Did you know that starfish can regenerate their arms?" Ben suddenly asked one day when we found ourselves on a beach. He picked up a dried starfish, examining it closely. Yes, I've heard about that, I replied, stepping closer. Incredible, isn't it? Just like a human heart, he said thoughtfully, shifting his gaze to me. It can heal itself after being wounded, if given time and space. I nodded silently, feeling his words leave a deep imprint on my thoughts. Was it a coincidence that he chose such a metaphor, or was it a hint at my own emotional struggles? Either way, his words made me reflect on my emotional state, on what truly mattered. In the days that followed, we continued exploring the islands. Ben always found something remarkable, whether it was a hidden trail leading to a waterfall or an old market in a small coastal town. He was like a magnet, attracting adventure and joy, and I realized that his presence made this journey special, unique. One evening, we stayed on the deck, watching the sunset cast warm tones over the world around us. Luke had already gone to bed, tired after a day full of activities. Have you ever thought about how little we really need to be happy? Ben asked suddenly, his voice thoughtful. He sat with his knees drawn up, his profile outlined against the backdrop of the setting sun. Sometimes, I admitted, but sometimes it feels like true happiness requires so much. Maybe it just feels that way, he smiled. Look at us. We're here, far from everything, and it seems like we have all we need to be happy. Peace, quiet, each other's company. And the stars, I added, smiling as I looked up at the sky. Don't forget about the stars. We sat in silence, admiring the night, and I felt the complicated questions about life and happiness gently fade from my mind, making way for more delicate, tender emotions that I tried not to acknowledge, even to myself. Aboard the yacht, gently swaying on the waves beneath the starry sky, time seemed to stand still. Luke, exhausted after a day of sailing and exploring, had quickly retreated to the cabin, leaving Ben and me alone with the night. The sea breeze wrapped around us, cool and refreshing, and I pulled my light scarf tighter around my shoulders. Ben stood nearby, leaning against the railing, watching the play of light on the water's surface. I joined him, trying not to think about how close we were standing to each other. You know, Sarah, this is one of my favorite spots on the yacht, he began, his eyes still fixed on the ocean. It feels like you could almost reach out and touch the stars, don't you think? Yes, it's truly magical, I replied, letting my gaze drift over the night sky, dotted with stars. The air was rich with the scent of salt and freshness, and I breathed deeply, wanting to capture this moment forever. But you know what's even more magical? His voice softened as he turned to face me. There was a smile on his face, but something deeper flickered in his eyes, more serious than his usual playful tone. It's those moments when you realize you're next to someone who makes your heart feel warmer, even in the middle of an endless ocean. I felt my heart skip a beat, my cheeks flushing as I quickly looked away, trying to hide my growing unease. Ben, He took a step closer, and our eyes met. Sarah, I should have done this a long time ago, he whispered, and before I could respond, his lips gently touched mine. It was a soft, tentative kiss that both shocked and captivated me. I closed my eyes, surrendering to the moment as my body responded to his touch. For a brief instant, I forgot about everything: Luke, the yacht, the stars. All of it faded into the background in the face of this new, unexpected feeling. When we finally pulled apart, I felt dazed, confused. Ben, we can't. This isn't right, I whispered, though every fiber of my being screamed in contradiction to those words. He touched my cheek gently, his fingers soft against my skin. I know, Sarah, and I'm sorry if this made you uncomfortable, but I had to do it. You deserve to know that you're not just my cousin's wife to me. I stood there, speechless, trying to process what had just happened. The feelings I had for Ben, the ones I had been trying so hard to ignore these past days, suddenly surged to the surface. In his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own turmoil, fear, doubt, and, Most terrifying of all, hope. What do we do now? I asked quietly, still tasting his kiss on my lips. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know one thing. I don't want to hurt you. We can forget this ever happened if that's what you want. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're comfortable. We stood in silence, listening to the sound of the sea, feeling each other's warmth. That night, on the deck of the yacht, beneath the endless expanse of stars, it felt as though my heart was choosing its own path. After that night, when the stars bore witness to our forbidden kiss, I couldn't stop thinking about Ben. We both tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the glances we exchanged spoke volumes. Luke, absorbed in his activities and love for the sea, seemed oblivious to the changes in our behavior. He would leave for hours, diving, leaving Ben and me alone on the yacht or on one of the islands we would find ourselves at during our travels. Ben and I started exploring the islands together, trying to remain unnoticed. It was a strange, mixed feeling. On one hand, I felt the thrill and joy of our secret meetings. But on the other, guilt weighed on me because of Luke. Yet every time I looked into Ben's eyes, my doubts faded away. One day, when Luke had gone to explore the coral reefs on the other side of the island for the entire day, Ben suggested visiting a little-known waterfall that he'd heard about in one of the coastal villages. We set off in search, following an old, overgrown trail winding through lush tropical vegetation. The hot air was filled with the scents of flowers and the sea, and the sounds of the jungle made us feel completely secluded from the rest of the world. Sarah, look! Ben exclaimed, pointing at a rare bird that flew up right in front of us. His excitement was infectious, and I couldn't help but smile back. When we finally reached the waterfall, I was stunned by the sight. Water cascaded down a high cliff, creating a rainbow where the streams met the sunlight. The place was truly magical. Do you think it was worth coming here? Ben asked, offering me his hand to help me down to the pool beneath the waterfall. Without a doubt, I replied, gripping his hand tightly. For a moment, our touch lingered in the air, and I felt that familiar warmth of electricity between us again. We swam under the waterfall, laughing and splashing around, letting the pure water wash away all doubts and fears. Ben looked at me as if I were the only woman in the world, and at that moment, I truly felt special. Later, as we sat on a rock watching the sun begin to set, we talked about life, our dreams, and how strange it was that we had found each other at such a complicated time. I didn't plan on falling in love, Sarah, especially not like this. Not now, he confessed, his voice full of conflicting emotions. Neither did I said quietly, resting my head on his shoulder. That evening, with the sound of the water and the fading day, we both realized that this was no longer just a flirtation or an adventure. It was something more, something that required decisions from us, decisions that could change our lives forever. Time on the yacht seemed to pass in a strange way. On one hand, the days felt long, filled with endless ocean horizons and blazing sunsets, but on the other, I couldn't savor each moment enough. My feelings for Ben grew stronger each day, like a storm sweeping everything around us. It was so intense and unpredictable that I forgot about everything. About Luke, our commitments, and what awaited us once we returned home. One morning, when Luke had gone for another dive with some divers from a nearby village, Ben approached me with a mysterious smile. Sarah, how about going on a little adventure today? He suggested, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I felt curiosity spark inside me. What kind of adventure do you have in mind? There's an old fishing boat nearby, he explained, pointing toward a small dock hidden behind the trees on the far end of the beach. The locals say it belongs to an old fisherman who rarely goes out to sea anymore. I thought it might be fun to rent it and head out to the coral reef. It's not on any of the usual tour routes, and I've heard it's incredibly beautiful. I couldn't hide my smile. My rational side urged me to decline, but my heart fluttered at the thought of another secret outing, far from prying eyes. I nodded. Why not? We arranged to meet with the fisherman, and within an hour, We were boarding his old rickety boat. The fisherman seemed unbothered by our spontaneous plan. He simply nodded, checked the engine, and gave us a few instructions. "Be careful," he said, his tanned face lighting up with a smile. "The coral reefs are not just beautiful, but dangerous too. Follow my advice, and you'll be fine." Ben nodded gratefully and helped me aboard. The boat rattled and swayed as if it might fall apart at the slightest bump, but I couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement at what was ahead. We were ready for a new adventure. The trip to the reef took about an hour. The sea was calm, with only a light breeze stirring my hair. Ben and I sat side by side, and I could feel his hand occasionally brushing mine, as if by accident. I couldn't help but notice how our conversations were becoming more intimate and personal. We talked about everything, from childhood memories to our deepest dreams. Time flew by, and I could sense something important growing between us, something more than just a fleeting attraction. When we finally reached the reef, its vibrant colors unfolded before us. It was breathtaking. Living corals in every shade of red, orange, and purple glowed against the crystal clear water. Ben pulled out masks and fins, handing me one. "Ready to dive into this underwater paradise?" he asked with a smile. "Absolutely," I replied, feeling a thrill ignite inside me. We dove into the water simultaneously, and I felt the cool waves envelop my body, refreshing and awakening all my senses. The water was so clear that you could see every inch of the reef stretching out below like a fantastical underwater forest. We swam side by side, occasionally diving deeper to explore the hidden nooks of the coral formations. Ben pointed out rare fish and sea creatures, and I couldn't stop marveling at the beauty around us. At one point, he swam closer, and without saying a word, took my hand. I froze but didn't pull away. We hovered in the water, surrounded by the reef, as if the whole world had stopped, leaving just the two of us. In that moment, when his fingers touched mine, I realized I could no longer deny it. My feelings for Ben had grown into something more. In this water, in this underwater paradise, his touch sparked something in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. His eyes, gazing at me through the mask, were filled with warmth and sincerity. He didn't say a word, but I didn't need to hear him. I knew he felt the same. We continued swimming, holding hands, and I allowed myself to forget everything else, sinking into the moment. Under the water, time seemed to stand still, and our hearts beat in unison. When we resurfaced, I could still feel my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what to say, or how to make sense of what had just happened. Ben climbed onto the boat first and extended his hand to help me up. "That was incredible," I whispered, still breathless from excitement and emotion. "Yes," he replied, looking into my eyes. "Incredible." We both knew that this moment had changed everything. As we plunged into the depths of not just the water, but our own emotions, we now had to decide where our path would lead next. And although I was afraid to take that step, I knew that on this day, we both realized that our feelings had grown too deep to ignore. Each new day on the yacht, each new island we sailed to, only intensified the feelings I had for Ben. It wasn't just an infatuation or a fleeting passion, as I tried to convince myself at the beginning. It was something deeper, something that both frightened and enticed me. With each encounter, every glance and every touch, I felt myself losing control over my emotions. Luke seemed increasingly absorbed in his diving and exploration of the underwater world. Every day, he would dive with local guides, returning in the evening exhausted but satisfied. He clearly enjoyed the trip, unaware of what was happening in my heart. I tried to hide my feelings, to remain composed, but I must not have done a very good job. More and more, it seemed like Ben could see right through me. One day, when we stopped at another island, Ben approached me with a suggestion. "Sarah, how about we go for a walk? There's an old trail here that leads to an abandoned lighthouse. The locals say the view of the sunset from there is incredible. I knew I shouldn't agree. I knew that the longer we spent together, the harder it would be to keep control of my emotions. But I also knew I couldn't say no. I nodded, and we set off. The path to the lighthouse was not easy. The trail was narrow and overgrown, at times almost invisible due to the dense vegetation. We scrambled over rocks, leapt over small streams, and every time I stumbled or lost my balance, Ben gently steadied me, touching my arm or shoulder. These touches, though fleeting, felt like electric shocks running through my body, leaving behind a troubling excitement. When we reached the lighthouse, the sun was already setting. From that height, the view was breathtaking. The ocean stretched to the horizon, its waters bathed in golden and purple hues, and the sky seemed to burn with light. I stood, mesmerized by the scene, when I felt Ben step closer. "It's magnificent, isn't it?" he whispered in my ear, and I felt his breath on my skin. "Yes," I replied, without turning, trying to focus on the sunset and not his presence beside me. But he didn't step back. I felt his hand gently touch mine, and I couldn't resist, my fingers instinctively intertwined with his. We stood like that, holding hands, watching as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, saying nothing. Inside me, a fire was growing that couldn't be extinguished. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "You know how I feel about you, and I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. I can't stop thinking about you." I turned to him, and our eyes met. There was so much honesty, so much sincerity in his gaze that I couldn't hold back. "Ben, I feel it too." My voice trembled. "I feel it too. But what are we doing? We can't just—" "I know," he interrupted me, his hands gently resting on my shoulders. "I know it's complicated, that we're hurting Luke. But Sarah, we can't ignore what's happening. We need to find a way to figure this out. Together." I felt my eyes fill with tears. Inside, a storm of emotions raged. Love, guilt, fear, and despair. I loved Luke, but my feelings for Ben were so strong that I couldn't ignore them any longer. "Ben, I don't know what to do. I'm so confused." He slowly moved closer, wrapping his arms around my shoulders. "I am too, Sarah. But I'm sure of one thing. I want to be with you, at least for a while, to understand what this means for us. Do you want that too?" I was silent for a few seconds, struggling with my internal conflicts. But then I nodded. "Yes, I want that, but I'm scared." "Don't be afraid," he said, pulling me closer. "We'll figure it out. The only thing that matters is that we're together now and being honest with each other." His lips slowly leaned towards mine, and I felt my heart stop in anticipation. At that moment, I knew that the fire that had ignited between us could no longer be extinguished. We gave in to the temptation, knowing there was no turning back. When his lips touched mine, I felt my whole body respond to the kiss. It wasn't just passion or desire, it was something much deeper, something that awakened all the hidden feelings inside me. We were like two flames merging into one, unable to resist the fire that burned stronger and stronger. We stood there, kissing beneath the setting sun, and I knew that everything had changed. I would have to make a choice that would determine my life. But for now, in this moment, I wanted only one thing: to be near Ben, feeling his warmth, his breath, his sincerity, and his passion. We slowly pulled away from each other, and I looked into his eyes, knowing I had taken a step towards something unknown and dangerous. But I also knew that I couldn't return to the life I had before. We began the walk back along the trail, and I held his hand tighter than ever before. Ben didn't let go of my hand, and I felt that we had both committed to something important. I could no longer ignore my feelings, and it seemed he couldn't either. We didn't say a word on the way back. Words were unnecessary. In that moment, in the space between us and the world, I realized our hearts had already made the decision, and that decision was as inevitable as the sunset we had just witnessed together. The first rays of sunlight touched the water as I woke up on the yacht. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and freshness. I lay in my cabin, listening to the quiet splashing of waves against the hull and staring at the ceiling. Luke and I had been anchored near a small, uninhabited island for several days, where he spent his days diving while I found more and more excuses to spend time with Ben. Our glances met more often than was safe, and there was something in them that Luke couldn't help but notice. But today, something changed. Luke returned to the yacht earlier than usual, his gaze focused on me as if he were trying to understand something. He came over, hugged me, and quietly whispered in my ear, "I thought today we could spend the day together, the three of us." His words caught me off guard. We rarely spent time together as a trio. Usually, Luke went off on his diving excursions, leaving Ben and me on the yacht or on the island. Perhaps he had sensed something. Perhaps my odd glances toward Ben had become too obvious. Or maybe it was just his desire to bring our relationship back to what it once was. "Of course," I replied, trying to inject as much enthusiasm into my voice as possible. "That would be great, wouldn't it, Ben?" Ben, who was sitting nearby, snapped out of his thoughts and smiled, though doubt flickered in his eyes. "Sure, why not? Let's have a picnic on the island." Luke nodded and suggested we bring some food and wine. I noticed how he was trying to appear relaxed, but there was a certain tension in his movements. He acted as if he suspected something, but didn't want to openly show his doubts. We set off for the island in a small boat, and it seemed like Luke was making a point to keep the three of us together. He told stories of his underwater adventures, trying to engage us in conversation, but I could feel the tension only growing. Every glance, every word held a hidden meaning. I often caught myself looking at Ben, and he at me. A wave of unease swelled inside me. On the island, Luke laid out a blanket, we set up the food, and he opened a bottle of wine. I avoided the wine, knowing it would help me relax, but it might also cause me to say something I shouldn't, and I couldn't afford that. Ben sat beside me, and we both struggled to avoid accidentally touching each other. I could feel Luke watching us, his eyes shifting between me and Ben. His smile was strained, but he tried to maintain an appearance of nonchalance. "Sarah," he began suddenly, "do you remember when we came here on our honeymoon? You were so happy back then." I nodded, feeling a bitterness rise within me. "Of course, Luke. It was a wonderful time. It feels like a long time ago." "Not that long," he replied, looking into my eyes. "But I feel like something's changed. You've become distant. Is something wrong?" I felt my hands start to tremble. Ben glanced at me discreetly, and his look told me he could sense the tension too. "No, Luke," I quickly replied, trying to hide my nervousness. "Everything's fine. I'm just a bit tired." Luke nodded slowly, but there was doubt in his eyes. "Are you sure? It just seems like you've changed. You often look toward Ben. Maybe I'm wrong, but—" He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. His words hung in the air like thunder in a clear sky. My heart began to race. It was clear that Luke was starting to suspect something, and perhaps even more than that. I glanced at Ben, and our eyes met. He looked as though he understood the gravity of the situation, and I saw something in his gaze. Was it fear? "Luke, stop," I said, trying to add firmness to my voice. "You're overreacting. We're just here to relax and enjoy our time together. Please, let's not ruin the day." He was silent for a moment, then nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. "Of course, you're right. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay between us." We continued our day, but the tension lingered. Every move, every word felt calculated, as if we were all walking on thin ice, afraid to make the wrong step. As the sun began to set, we started packing up to head back to the yacht. Luke suggested we take a walk along the shore, but Ben said he wanted to stay behind for a bit. Luke nodded, and we walked along the beach, leaving Ben behind. We walked in silence until Luke spoke again. Sarah, I know something's going on. Maybe you don't want to tell me, but I can feel it. Please, just tell me the truth. I stopped, turned to face him, and felt my eyes fill with tears. Luke, But at that moment, I couldn't find the words. Everything seemed too complicated and tangled. I couldn't tell him the truth, but I couldn't lie anymore either. I had to make a choice, and that choice had to be made right now. Luke looked at me, waiting for an answer, and I realized that this trip could no longer be what it was meant to be for us. I didn't know what to say, and the silence became the loudest answer of all. The evening was quiet. Only the occasional cry of a seagull broke the silence, echoing over the smooth surface of the sea. I lay in my cabin, trying to calm my heart, which was pounding wildly in my chest. Luke knew. He felt that something was wrong. I hadn't been able to shake that feeling ever since he asked me what was going on. I felt the situation was becoming more dangerous, like we were walking on the edge of a knife. When I left the cabin, Ben was nowhere to be seen, and a sense of unease crept over me. I decided to look for him on deck, but it was empty. Only Luke stood by the railing, watching the sunset. I walked closer, feeling as though I might faint. "Where's Ben?" I asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. Luke turned to me, staring straight into my eyes. "He said he wanted to be alone and think. Seems like he has something on his mind, too." I nodded, not knowing what to say. We stood there in silence, and I could feel the air between us grow thick with unspoken words and suspicions. "You know, Sarah," he finally began, his voice calm, but I sensed a storm brewing beneath the surface. "I went into your cabin today." My heart froze. "Why?" I asked, trying not to show my anxiety. "I wanted to leave a clean towel, and I found this." He held out a folded piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. It was the letter from Ben, the one he wrote to me last night when we decided it was time to figure out our feelings. I had left it in the cabin, never thinking Luke would find it. My fingers trembled as I took the letter, and I felt a knot tighten inside me. I looked at Luke, and his gaze was so cold and distant that it made me uneasy. He was waiting for an explanation, an excuse, a lie. But I couldn't say anything. "Don't you want to explain anything to me?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with tension, like a tightly wound string. I felt a wave of panic rising inside me. "Luke, it's not what you think," I began, but even to me, the words sounded hollow and false. He looked at me, and I saw not just anger, but pain in his eyes. Deep, cutting pain. "Then what is it, Sarah?" His voice grew louder. "Explain to me what this letter from your cousin is, and why I should believe there's nothing special about it." I remained silent, feeling the words catch in my throat. I knew I couldn't come up with an explanation that wouldn't sound absurd. Luke deserved the truth, and in that moment, I realized there was no point in lying any further. "Luke," I began again, tears welling up in my eyes. "I didn't want this to happen. I really didn't want to hurt you." He stepped closer, his face focused, but in his eyes, I saw his world falling apart. "You betrayed me, Sarah, with my own cousin. How could you?" At that moment, Ben appeared on deck, having overheard our conversation. He stopped when he saw the letter in Luke's hand and my tears. "Luke," he began, taking a step forward. "Don't you dare!" Luke spun toward him, his face filled with rage. "Don't you dare come near me right now! You betrayed me too, Ben. You were my brother. How could you do this to me?" Ben raised his hands, almost in surrender, but his voice was firm. "Luke, I'm not trying to justify what I did. But it happened. It happened because we both got lost in our feelings. I never planned this. I never wanted to hurt you." Luke shook his head, his face contorted with pain and anger. "You never wanted to hurt me? What about Sarah? Did you ever think about her? What will happen to her now that you've destroyed everything?" I stood between them, feeling the air grow heavier and heavier. "Please stop!" I cried. "We didn't want this to happen. I know how it looks, but we didn't plan." Luke cut me off. "Didn't plan? Sarah, this wasn't an accident. You both chose this, knowing it would hurt. Why? Why did you do it?" Tears streamed down my cheeks, and I felt a tremor run through my body. I didn't know what to say. Every explanation felt insignificant, every excuse empty. I knew that Ben and I had made a choice that shattered our world, and now we would have to live with the consequences. Luke fell silent, staring at us both, then suddenly turned and headed toward his cabin. "I need time to think," he threw over his shoulder, and I realized our lives would never be the same. Ben approached me, gently touching my hand. "Sarah," he began, but I just shook my head. "Not now, Ben," I whispered, feeling my strength leave me. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but I need time to figure it out." He nodded, his face tense and serious. We both knew there was much ahead: pain, regret, and perhaps a break we wouldn't survive. But one thing was clear: secrets would no longer remain secrets, and we would have to face the truth head on. The day that followed that fateful evening stretched on like an eternity. I couldn't shake the feeling of a heavy emptiness inside me. Everything seemed blurred, as if I were looking at the world through a dense fog. Luke had shut himself in his cabin, and I didn't dare disturb him. Ben avoided me, as if the distance between us could lessen the pain we both felt. I stood on deck, gazing out at the endless ocean, which seemed to have fallen into silence as well. The water was calm, but inside me, a storm raged. My feelings for Ben hadn't disappeared, but now they were wrapped in layers of guilt and regret. I knew that Luke and I had reached the point of no return, and as much as I wanted to try and fix everything, I understood it was too late. The sun was already setting when Luke stepped onto the deck. His face looked tired, his eyes red, as if he hadn't slept all night. He stopped in front of me, and I felt a chill in his gaze, as if his love for me had suddenly extinguished. "We need to talk, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I nodded, though I knew I wasn't ready to hear what he was about to say. My heart tightened in my chest, as if anticipating the inevitable. "I thought I could forgive you," he began, looking me straight in the eye. "I tried to understand what went wrong, what made you do it. But the more I think about it, the more I realize I can't look at you the same way anymore." Tears welled up in my eyes. I knew he was right. I knew our relationship would never be the same. "Luke, I began, but he raised a hand, stopping me. "No apologies, Sarah," he said. "I don't want to hear explanations. I just want to figure out what happens next." He fell silent, and I felt the weight of his words hanging in the air. I couldn't gather my thoughts, didn't know what to say. Every word I tried to find felt empty and insignificant. "I think we need to get a divorce," he finally said, his voice trembling. "I can't keep living with you, knowing you chose someone else. I can't live with the pain and the mistrust." His words hit me like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. I had known it was possible, but hearing it out loud was unbearable. "Luke, please." He shook his head. "No, Sarah, this isn't up for discussion. I don't want revenge. I don't want a scene. I just want to let go of this and start over. I hoped I could save our marriage, but now I realize that's impossible." Tears streamed down my face, and I felt my heart breaking into pieces. I loved Luke. I truly loved him. But at the same time, I knew my feelings for Ben were real. But those feelings, it turned out, had the power to destroy everything. Luke turned to leave, but I suddenly grabbed his hand. "Luke, wait!" I whispered, trying to find the words that could change his decision. He stopped, but didn't turn to face me. "What, Sarah? What do you want to say? That it was a mistake? That you regret it? That won't change what happened." I let go of his hand, realizing I couldn't convince him. I just, I just want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. He turned sharply toward me, and his eyes were filled with both anger and pain. Are you really sorry, Sarah? Or are you just sorry you got caught? His words were like a punch to the chest, and I felt my breath catch. I couldn't find the words. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, trembling from the cold and fear. Ben stood at the entrance to his cabin, watching us. When Luke passed by him without saying a word, Ben approached me. Sarah, he began, but I raised my hand to stop him. Ben, no, I said quietly, tears streaming down my cheeks. I can't talk right now. I can't even think. He paused for a moment, then nodded. I understand, but I'm here if you need me. I nodded in return, but inside, I felt that a chasm had already formed between us. Everything that had seemed so important and real suddenly lost its meaning. I knew we needed time to sort out our feelings, but I was afraid that we no longer had that time. Luke had retreated to his cabin again, and I realized that our journey had come to an end. I felt my heart shattering into pieces, unsure if I'd ever be able to put it back together. Inside me, there was a void, and I didn't know how to fill it. The next morning, Luke announced that we were heading back home. He wanted to end this trip as soon as possible, a trip that had turned into a nightmare for all of us. My heart sank at the thought that our marriage, our life together, everything we had built over the years, was now over. As we began the journey back to shore, I stood on deck, staring at the receding horizon, thinking about how different things could have been if I had made different choices. But now that everything was destroyed, I had to find a way to live with the consequences. And that, it seemed, was the hardest thing I'd ever have to do. When the yacht returned to the dock, I felt as if my life had suddenly changed forever. Luke was resolute in his decision to divorce, and I knew there was nothing I could do to alter his choice. Every word, every attempt to explain, only deepened the pain in his heart, and I saw him gradually distancing himself from me, turning into a stranger. The farewell was brief and cold. Luke gathered his things and left first. He didn't even glance back as he departed from the dock, and I don't blame him for that. At that moment, I realized that my life would never be the same. I was faced with a choice: to stay in this city filled with memories of the past, or to leave and try to start anew. Ben also left the yacht, leaving me a short note. I need time. I'll find you later. I wasn't sure what it meant, and frankly, at that moment, I wasn't focused on him. I needed to figure things out for myself. Days passed, full of agonizing reflections and emotions. I stayed at a small hotel near the dock, unable to return to a home that no longer felt like mine. I tried to find a way out of the darkness, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Luke's face full of pain and Ben's full of concern. I felt like I was at a crossroads, not knowing where to go next. One morning, I woke up with a clear understanding. I needed to leave. Leave as far away as possible from everything connected with this island, with our shared memories. I chose another island, a small, secluded place rarely visited by tourists. The local fishermen who had helped Ben and me with the boat rental for that fateful trip to the coral reefs agreed to transport me. On the way, I gazed at the blue horizon and thought about how I would begin a new life. A new place, new people, new opportunities. I wanted to leave my mistakes behind and find a way to forgive myself for what had happened. But the farther I traveled, the more I realized that I couldn't escape from myself. My feelings, my pain, my regrets were with me wherever I went. We arrived at the island late in the evening. It was quiet here, only the sound of the surf and the calls of distant birds. The locals greeted me warmly, offering a place to stay, a small cottage on a hill with an ocean view. The house was modest but cozy, and I felt it was exactly what I needed: solitude where I could find peace and sort out my thoughts. Weeks passed, and I began to settle in. The days dragged slowly, filled with minor chores and concerns. Each morning, I went to the beach to watch the sunrise and observed the waves crashing on the shore, slowly calming my mind. I started painting, a hobby I hadn't indulged in for a long time. The colors and canvas helped me express emotions that words could not. The locals accepted me as one of their own. They didn't ask unnecessary questions or invade my privacy. They only needed to know that I was just another woman deciding to start a new life on their island. They helped me find a job at a local cafe, where I started working a few times a week. This not only allowed me to distract myself, but also to feel useful. One evening, while returning home after a day at work, I stopped at the beach. The water was warm and gentle, and I allowed myself to enter, feeling the waves wash over my feet. I stood there, looking at the stars, and thought about how far I had come from the life I once knew. But even here, in this new life, I couldn't forget Luke and Ben. They were part of me, part of my story, and no distance could change that. My thoughts often turned to Luke. Where was he now? Had he found peace? Would he ever forgive me? I wrote him letters, but I never sent any. They were filled with words I wanted to say to him: apologies, regrets, admissions of still loving him and never wanting to hurt him, but I knew that words wouldn't change anything. All I could do was hope that one day he would find the happiness he deserved. As for Ben, his image haunted me everywhere. He was my companion in this new world, and I couldn't rid myself of thoughts about what might have been if we hadn't met. I questioned whether it had all been worth it. Were our feelings for each other strong enough to justify the pain we caused Luke? I struggled with these questions for a long time, and gradually, slowly, I came to an answer. Sometimes life gives us lessons we don't want to learn, but they are necessary for our growth. I realized that I couldn't move forward unless I forgave myself for what had happened. I made mistakes, but who hasn't? We are all human, and each of us is entitled to our own mistakes and falls. On the island, I found people who didn't judge me for my past, who gave me a chance to start fresh. And I realized that I had the strength to overcome this. I decided that I would move on, despite the pain and regrets. This was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, and I was ready to embrace it, no matter how challenging it might be. Each morning, I began with the thought that the past does not define my future. I was ready to let go of my guilt and start building a life that I could be proud of. This was my new horizon, and I was determined to make it bright.